Hello, we're starting day 4 of the seminar series titled World Wisdom About and for Social Change. I give the floor to the chair of the session, the host of the session, Janelle Brady, first year PhD student at the SJE department, and Zura Bavi. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Janelle Brady, and I'll be chairing the session today. We'll have a presentation done by Zora Abali, and it's on TDSB, so Toronto District School Board, Reforms Through Afrocentric and Indigenous Epistemologies. So yeah, we hope you enjoy the discussion, and it'll be a very interesting presentation. And just to add, Zora Abali is also a first-year PhD student in SJE, Social Justice Education at Boise, University of Toronto. So thank you.
Thank you, Janelle, for your introduction. So, my co-partner for this presentation is Janelle, but today I'm just going to take the presentation by myself. So, TDSB, Reforms for Afrocentric and Indigenous Epistemologies. We're going to start off with the fallacy of multiculturalism, because multiculturalism has been a buzzword and an official policy of education. Over the last decade, various movements for ethnocentric schooling have emerged for a common rationale. Purported liberal multicultural education has failed racialized and minoritized students. So the calls for ethnocentric education have come due to criticism for multiculturalism. We will address different ethnocentric projects, notably in the TDSB, as well as a critical analysis of liberal multicultural education and different policies which embed an ideology of white privilege and reflect neoliberal and market aims of education through socialization and assimilative practices. We will argue that multicultural education practices are divisive and prevent dialogue and solidarity between Indigenous learners and racialized immigrant students, also known as the divide and conquer strategies. We will critique hegemonic conceptualizations of what a teacher is and ought to be by dismantling the feminized white middle-class norm of teacher identity. We also have to think about teachers having a new identity and reconceptualizing teacher identity as that of a social justice agent. I will disrupt multicultural educational paradigms and neoliberal policy-making processes through an anti-racist framework in which counter-narratives through multicentric and decolonizing education can disrupt white supremacy and privilege in education. So, starting with the theoretical framework, anti-racism. Anti-racism involves the interrogation and dismantling of systems of white privilege, white supremacy, and hegemony through critical understandings of how racism detrimentally affects racialized bodies through institutional, systemic, and systematic systems of oppression. Anti-racism calls on educators to examine their own unexamined and unconscious biases, as well as their own social locations and positions of power and oppression. It is imperative for educators to examine their social location to determine how their positionings implicate their teaching practices and treatment of learners in the classroom. The curriculum remains overwhelmingly Eurocentric in terms of pedagogical practices, socializing aspects, content, and education is overwhelmingly based on false colonial notions of white supremacy. So as I mentioned, Eurocentric educational paradigms are the dominant form of education in our schools. Teachers in TDSB and Toronto District School Board schools are overwhelmingly white, and same with leadership positions. The contemporary multicultural education paradigm silences the various multifaceted racisms, oppressions, and victimizations of Indigenous and racialized students at the hands of white supremacy and privilege. The omission of marginalized voices also silences dialogue concerning various subjectivities and positionalities in relation to experiences of othering by Eurocentric hegemony. So, as we know, a lot of the time people talk about liberal multiculturalism. I want to call it neoliberal multiculturalism because it's not only to create a pluralistic, divisive society, it's also intertwined with neoliberal and capitalist agendas. So education is aligned with employability and monetization, not citizenry, social or political thought, as are the traditional purposes of liberal education, as well as in higher ed, as we see vocationalization happening. Policies to ensure diversity and multiculturalism are in place to ensure that students, as customers, are reflected in their classrooms, similar to the workplace diversity initiatives to ensure that there's no lawsuit or legal implications. At the surface level, so their communities and social locations are to blame should they not assimilate into the needs and expectations of a marketized curriculum and school culture. So this again places the blame and the deficit on groups that don't conform, and again their physical and ethnic characteristics are pointed to as a reason for this failure to conform. Liberal education, as I had mentioned, has been replaced by neoliberal education. Having intercultural practices in place at the school through its discursive framework means that children all have the same access and opportunity to move up the social ladder, and education as an equalizer is effective. However, this critique at the surface level both masks and prevents any critical interrogation of power relations, hidden agendas, and hidden curriculum. These approaches to manage the racialized student population in which students must conform to the white hegemonic neoliberal education premised on multiculturalism. Meritocracy. Failure to do so will result in the self-fulfilling prophecy that such achievement gaps and disengagement is a result of their othered identities. So dealing with the other ethnocentric schools in TDSB, so TDSB has created 2 high-profile schools. One's an Indigenous school and one's the Afrocentric alternative school. These have been seen as a pioneering aspiration of the TDSB, but they also acknowledge a failure of the system to reach marginal learners. So the Afrocentric alternative school and the First Nations Junior and Senior School of Toronto were implemented as sites of resistance, but also, at the same time, last resorts, implemented to demonstrate altruism and accountability to the public and address achievement gaps and high dropout rates among Indigenous and African Canadian learners. Some questions we want to pose include: how does the colonial legacy of residential schools continue to inform invasive procedures of status and self-identification among Indigenous learners? And how does policy operate as a tool of neocolonialism, and why is there an emphasis on tracking Indigenous students? So it's difficult to have a clear analysis of the benefits of ethnocentric schools, as quantifying benchmarks for assessment and evaluation of these schools are still reliant on very Eurocentric standardized tests and marketized neoliberal quality assurance and accountability mechanisms. There's also been a lack of action by the federal government to dissolve the Indian Act or to support Indigenous autonomy and sovereignty over education. So until the Indian Act is officially dissolved and until there is autonomy by First Nations groups over education, education will continue to be a tool of neocolonialism. We argue that ethnocentric education prevents dialogue, unity, and solidarity between Indigenous peoples and immigrants of color, thus making it a counterproductive pursuit. In terms of the Afrocentric school, some people have praised it as an innovative way to address the achievement gaps and the high dropout rates among African Canadian learners, but at the same time, it also removes an entire population, generalizes the population, and keeps them separate from other groups that they could build solidarity with. So we advocate for anti-racist education through solidarity, because anti-racist education counters the multicultural, or also known as intercultural education approaches, as it disrupts complicity in meritocratic and colorblind practices by centering race and critiquing power relations and their manifestation within the culture of schooling. So George Day offers a centric education approach as a counter-narrative to contemporary multicultural or neoliberal multicultural practices, positing centric education consequently refutes hegemonic education. Ending the current dominance of Eurocentricity requires introducing other forms of centric knowledge that emphasizes the contributions of other peoples to knowledge production and world history. We advocate that for centric learning to take place, there must be dialogue between Indigenous and racialized students. Classrooms must be a safe space where students can bring their own stories to their learning environment and embed their own social location into pedagogy. These conversations must allow for students to share their experiences and the implications of colonialisms on their lives, as well as the ways they are impacted by systems of white supremacy. However, it is vital that this dialogue occurs with the understanding that Canada is a colonial nation and not a post-colonial nation, with ongoing and genocidal practices against Indigenous peoples and how settlers perpetuate such colonialism. So in order to dismantle these divisions that have been caused by multiculturalism, which identifies people through generalizations and separates them as having nothing in common with each other, but just celebrates their tokenized identities, there needs to be solidarity through and an alliance through education. This dialogue moves beyond ethnocentric education. Ethnocentric education separates racialized bodies and differentiates them to the white norm, whereas centric education and dialogue provide a counter-narrative through what Glenn Singleton refers to as courageous conversations. The separate and compartmentalizing marginalized identities creates the discourse of competing marginalities in which there is no solidarity, but instead animosity and divisive politics meant to place one group against another in competition for resources. And this is very much relevant to neoliberal education rather than multicultural education, because we're not only just talking about differences and pitting people one against the other, but we're talking about resources and meritocracy and how different groups have to compete and look at each other through animosity to get scarce resources and conform through an internalized oppression to basically Eurocentricize themselves in order to achieve the Canadian dream. Finally, we'll move to interrogating teacher identity, because none of this can happen at the school level unless the teacher is socially aware of these issues. For solidarity through anti-racist and centric education and dialogue to occur, we must redefine teachers as agents of social justice. The teacher identity is dominated by a feminized, white, middle-class, caring persona, which fundamentally lacks a critical consciousness and is omitted from the nice image of the teaching profession. The teacher identity must be deconstructed and redefined. Social justice must be embedded in teacher education programs rather than mere competence training and models of equity, inclusiveness, and diversity, which mask neoliberal agendas of multicultural education. Thank you so much.
Thank you, that was pretty good.
I got really nervous because I was looking at the camera.
Questions?
So I actually don't have any questions. You've actually covered everything that I feel and I see in education, and I really like the work that you're doing. And I feel like it addresses a lot of the issues and a lot of the solutions that we've been pushed to in addressing the issues. And it shows that there is a pitting of groups against each other. And you see that a lot happening in the education system, but your work can be relatable to the not-for-profit sector, into academia as well, where groups are competing, like you might say, competing voices, right?
Competing marginalities, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, so it becomes a bit of oppression Olympics, as one of the scholars have pointed out, so I think it's excellent work.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important to go beyond just multiculturalism, because we can't dismantle multiculturalism or interrogate it or critique it without thinking about the market relations and the capitalist society that we live in, because that all creates this sort of nasty rivalry and competition for resources, just like in colonization. It was the same thing. It was a domination for resources, a more overt one, and now it's a more subtle one.